Turkiye's cities have been transformed into protest sites. The arrest of an opposition figure has had a galvanizing effect on the country's politics. 2 more Palestinian journalists killed by the Israeli military. One of them saw it coming, filing the story of his own death in advance. And the Milei effect on politics and journalism in Argentina. There is unrest on the Turkish streets, the biggest political protests in more than a decade. Mass demonstrations in multiple cities involving millions of people following the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem Imamoglu, a politician considered to represent the biggest challenge to Recep Tayyip Erdogan's presidency. The number of people arrested at the time of this recording is approaching 2,000. That includes journalists. And the state's security response has been criticized by rights groups and the UN alike. Competing narratives, Imamoglu arguing the charges against him are political, Erdogan dismissing the protests as misguided, do not get equal play in the news coverage. But Turks are used to that. The vast majority of their media outlets have succumbed over the years. But despite continuing official efforts involving everyone from judges to broadcast regulators to suppress the news coverage, protesters keep pouring onto the streets, dissenting, making themselves heard. 4 voices on the political unrest exploding across Turkey. 2 of them from within the country, supporters of the Erdogan government, including one at a newspaper in Istanbul. And 2 voices currently in exile, since being critical of the authorities has landed some of their journalistic colleagues in Turkish prisons.
The fact that there's some protest shows actually a good involvement in the democratic process of Turkey. People are able to voice their opinion publicly, and process is actually is going as it should. This is a very healthy part of democratic process.
Well, everybody should watch social media and see what's happening on the ground every night. Young people are beaten mercilessly, and Erdogan is making threats to all the protesters. So it doesn't show that there is democracy, but it only shows that people are trying to protect democracy from a regime that is not a big fan of elections, obviously.
The protests are a byproduct of a looming showdown between Turkiye's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and his AK party, who have held power since 2003, and the candidate who represents the greatest challenge to Erdogan in the next election, Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu of the opposition CHP. On March 19th, as police gathered outside his home, Imamoglu posted this video on X, telling millions of followers he was about to be arrested on corruption and terrorism charges.
Milletimizin iradesini gasp etmeye çalışan bir avuç akıl, ama yılmayacağımı bilmenizi istiyorum.
The demonstrators who then hit the streets call the arrest politically driven. The protests also have an economic element to them because of spiraling inflation, a cost of living that's on the rise. Protesters have clashed with police, resulting in more than 1,800 arrests. 11 media workers have been jailed, the majority of them photojournalists documenting the protests. These demonstrations are the biggest Turks have seen since 2013, when their media outlets became a big part of the story. Instead of covering the unrest on their doorstep in downtown Istanbul, many news outlets downplayed it. One channel, CNN Turk, famously broadcast a documentary about penguins in Antarctica instead, creating a new moniker for pro-government news outlets in Turkey. Penguin media.
Even as people were marching in the streets, hundreds of thousands, they were broadcasting documentaries about penguins. And so people were infuriated, and they continue to pretend that none of this is happening. When they broadcast news, it's parroting the government narrative.
Bakıldığı zaman burada çil dökülen bir şey var. Ekrem İmamoğlu var. Bu bir suç şebekesinin lideri olduğu karşımıza net olarak çıkıyor. Yani.
So of course the opposition is angry, very angry, and calling on people to boycott these news channels.
Media in Turkey is very polarized, and this is a fact. There is the free opposition media as well as the pro-government media. On both sides, their narratives are shaped based on how they approach any significant issue within Turkey, be it political issue, be it social issues or economic issues. So that polarization is there.
Unfortunately, it has been a long time since we have seen any part of the media that is not biased. Yes, there are those media outlets that without a condition support the government, and there are those media outlets that will unconditionally support the opposition.
Laying out the media landscape in that way, press freedom groups would argue, is far from a complete picture. According to the Paris-based media watchdog Reporters Without Borders, 90% of Turkish media outlets are effectively under the Erdogan government's control. Judges help suppress news coverage that is critical of the government by censoring that content. The head of Turkiye's media regulator, Rütük, has threatened news channels with sanctions. Then Rütük banned a pro-opposition channel, Sözcü TV, for 10 days over its coverage of the unrest.
7/24, 10 gün boyunca Sözcü televizyonuna ulaşamayacaksınız.
The authorities also arrested the BBC's reporter in Istanbul and deported him for doing the same. Online voices have been affected too. When the protests broke out, X agreed to block more than 100 Turkish accounts before Elon Musk, under considerable public pressure, sued the Erdogan government to get those accounts up and running again. The Turkish authorities have consistently used lawfare against voices they want silenced, including the arrests of dozens of journalists, most of them Kurds, during the last election campaign in 2023.
Mainstream media did not really raise their voices against these imprisonments of Kurdish and socialist media members. And then gradually the circle became smaller and smaller and smaller. I am one of the first people who were, fired from mainstream media. But until I was fired, there were so many people that were made example just to, spread fear to the media.
There really is no free media in Turkey today, and so the opposition has to rely on social media a fair bit. But we all know that right now social media is also under attack in Turkey, and Twitter in particular, X, Elon Musk, has been cooperating with Turkish authorities, withholding the accounts of many journalists in Turkey. I am one of them, by the way. So people in Turkey, I have over 400,000 followers, but they can't read any of my tweets, and I have many colleagues who are in the same situation today.
10 days into the protests, the Turkish authorities will be concerned that this movement appears to have legs. They might also fear the recurrence of history. In 1999, Recep Tayyip Erdogan was the mayor of Istanbul. He had national politics in his sights. The government of the day ended up throwing him in jail over dubious, trumped-up charges of religious incitement. 4 months later, Erdogan emerged from prison. Turks rallied behind him, and 3 years after that, elected him their national leader. Should Ekrem Imamoglu end up taking a similar path to the president's office, he may one day thank Erdogan's AK Party for inadvertently helping another mayor of Istanbul get elected to the highest office in the land.
Mr. Erdogan's political story, it's not a match for Mr. Imamoglu's story. There's mixing apples with oranges. Mr. Erdogan, his movement was for many decades oppressed by those linked to the political elite of Turkey at the time. When he went to prison, he said, I'm going to go to prison and I will come back stronger. If Mr. Imamoglu is proven to be innocent, I think his comeback will be very, very strong and very influential in Turkish politics in the years ahead.
And that, unfortunately, is why it seems unlikely that Imamoglu will be freed anytime soon. Because the minute he steps out of that prison, he's a political giant. When Erdogan came to power in 2002, he offered Turkey more hope than it had seen in decades. He did a lot of good things, sweeping reforms that convinced the European Union to open full membership talks with Turkey in 2005. So one has to credit him for what he did then, which is why it's so tragic to see the same person reverse that legacy and become a tyrant.
Millions of people on the streets simultaneously in every city, including the strongholds of AKP. This tells us that Turkey is done with Erdogan. But then authoritarian regimes, they do not go just because people do not like them. They have to be challenged seriously.
This past week, Israel targeted and killed 2 more Palestinian journalists in Gaza, Hossam Shabat and Mohammed Mansour. More than 230 media workers in Gaza have now been killed by Israeli forces since October 7th, 2023, and Tariq Nafi has been following this story.
Hossam Shabat, the Al Jazeera Mubaser reporter killed by the Israeli military this week, predicted his own death. Last October, after the Israeli military published a terrorist target list featuring Shabat and other journalists, he wrote, "Israel's army has released fabricated dossiers framing us. This blatant and belligerent attempt to transform us, the last witnesses in the north, into killable targets is an assassination threat, an obvious attempt to preemptively justify our murder." Shabat told colleagues he lived with the fear he was being hunted by Israeli forces.
He was getting calls, and the spokesperson in Arabic for the Israeli military is calling him out by name, calling out Anas al-Sharif and other journalists, saying that we're going to get you. And so this is kind of new, like preemptively and openly targeting them.
Shabat was killed in an airstrike on his car in Beit Lahia. Hours earlier, Israeli forces had bombed the home of another journalist, Mohammed Mansour, in Khan Yunis. In a post on X, Israel acknowledged it had deliberately killed Shabat, saying he carried out his actions under the cover of an Al Jazeera journalist. Yesterday, he was eliminated by the IDF. Don't let the press vest confuse you. Hossam was a terrorist. The Committee to Protect Journalists has called on Israel to, quote, stop making unsubstantiated allegations to justify killing members of the press. But this pattern has repeated over and over, with Israeli officials smearing reporters, aid workers, and medics as terrorists to demonize them and justify their unlawful killing. Shabat was displaced more than 20 times. He endured forced hunger and exhaustion to keep on reporting from the devastated north of the Gaza Strip. At just 23, he had already lived through 4 Israeli invasions or assaults on Gaza before October 7th. Since then, he'd witnessed dozens of his colleagues killed.
Hossam Shabat, Jazeera Mubaser.
It is a measure of the place Shabat was in before he was killed that he wrote his own obituary. In a message shared by friends, he said, "I fulfilled my duty as a journalist. I risked everything to report the truth, and now I am finally at rest, something I haven't known in the past 18 months. I did all this because I believe in the Palestinian cause. I believe this land is ours, and it has been the highest honor of my life to die defending it and serving its people."
Thanks, Tariq. It has been more than a year now since President Javier Milei burst onto Argentina's political scene wielding a chainsaw, his symbolic tool for slashing government spending and shaking up the establishment. Since then, Milei's austerity measures have delivered Argentina's first budget surplus in more than a decade, but also sent poverty levels skyrocketing. Beyond the economic upheaval, Milei has also launched and escalated a war on the press. From branding journalists as corrupt and claiming they're part of a caste, to shutting down the state-owned news agency, Milei has made it clear the Argentinian media are among his prime enemies and will be treated as such. And like many populist politicians before him, Milei relies on social media to bypass traditional news outlets. We spoke with two Argentinian journalists at opposite ends of the political spectrum about the changing news and information landscape there and the impact of Javier Milei's war against the media.
Si el presidente Milei no tolera, no admite, no entiende la existencia de un periodismo profesional.
Escuchen, escuchen periodistas ensobrados. Esto es lo que siente la gente por ustedes.
El presidente entiende que la prensa debe tomar partido, ¿sí?
Los ataques a la prensa en realidad se manifiestan en expresiones muy violentas contra periodistas, y te diría que periodistas casi de todo el espectro ideológico, salvo los que están de verdad muy alineados con él y con su discurso.
Si ellos quieren mentir, calumniar, injuriar, ensuciar, decir cualquier aberración y pretenden que ni siquiera les conteste. Por eso gran parte del periodismo en Argentina odia la red X.
Y él cree que efectivamente la prensa profesional independiente prácticamente no debe existir y debe ser sustituida por la opinión pública que se expresa a través de las redes sociales. Y lamentablemente el presidente no ofrece conferencia de prensa, nunca ha dado un reportaje a alguien independiente.
Buen día a todos.
El vocero del presidente, el señor Manuel Adorni, se le ocurrió una cosa muy loca de que la gente a través de algún procedimiento, presumo de redes sociales, indique cuál es el periodista que debe preguntarle al vocero del presidente.
Lo estamos pensando de una manera que la gente se sienta representada, que se sienta informada.
Una suerte de lotería, ¿no es cierto?, en donde la pregunta del día la tiene que formular alguien elegido seguramente por trolls impulsados por el propio gobierno.
Estoy buscando un esquema donde la gente pueda decidir quién se va y quién se queda.
El problema de la libertad de expresión en Argentina es un problema de arrastre de hace mucho tiempo y tiene que ver con la concentración, no tiene que ver con los insultos de Milei. El discurso de los medios es un discurso que muchas veces esconde los grandes problemas que tienen las mayorías populares. En las últimas manifestaciones, el Ministerio de Seguridad llevó adelante una enorme represión y llevó además muchas detenciones y gente que no tenía nada que ver terminó encarcelada.
Milei, basura, gozo la dictadura.
El gobierno sigue mintiendo y los grandes medios siguen sosteniendo las mentiras de los medios. Bueno, Clarín es uno de los grandes monopolios, ¿no?, de medios de Argentina. Clarín lo que dice es que fueron los violentos los que fueron detenidos, que fueron los violentos los que generaron los desmanes en las manifestaciones. Y en realidad sabemos que está desmentido por cualquiera que haya ido a estas manifestaciones, que las manifestaciones son llevadas adelante por gente que simplemente quiere ir a ejercer su derecho de protesta y su libertad de expresión y que termina reprimida por la policía.
Donde, por supuesto, se mezcla la política, se mezcla la publicidad oficial que contribuye con los medios cercanos al presidente Milei. Es cierto que Milei es también un hijo de su tiempo, un presidente conectado con un clima de época, ¿no? Y esta es una época en donde el mundo se ha radicalizado, donde predominan las posturas extremas, tanto de un lado como del otro, donde las posturas moderadas y más de centro están dinamitadas. Y en esa radicalización cae la prensa.
El partido de la casta está bien organizado porque juegan para su favor los periodistas corruptos.
Así que evidentemente hay un ambiente adverso a la libertad de expresión que excede por mucho, me parece a mí, a Milei, ¿no? Hay un ambiente general de cuestionamiento de la prensa en el mundo, producto de varias cuestiones, ¿no? los años de los Kirchner, en donde también en la Argentina había un ambiente muy adverso al periodismo profesional. Los Kirchner atacaban a las compañías de medios y Milei ataca a los periodistas, ¿no? Esto parece un detalle, pero no es un detalle. Entonces ellos creían eso, digamos, que los enemigos del gobierno y de la gente eran los dueños de los medios.
Mirá, a mí me parece que lo que tuvo el kirchnerismo es que el kirchnerismo intentó dar esa famosa batalla cultural. La concentración de medios era un problema entonces, por eso es que el kirchnerismo presentó una ley de medios, que era una ley antimonopólica básicamente. Esa ley fue muy batallada justamente por esos grandes medios de comunicación. Es una ley que por lo mismo nunca llegó a ser aplicada, con lo cual los monopolios se mantuvieron intactos. Entonces eso fue un problema. Los medios de comunicación siguen perteneciendo a los mismos dueños. Mi trabajo se vio parcialmente afectado por el gobierno de Milei porque en realidad a las 2 semanas de que hubiera asumido Milei en el poder, a mí me echaron del canal de noticias en el que yo trabajaba y nunca me dieron ninguna explicación, pero yo creo que es sospechoso porque, bueno, creo que dentro de ese canal posiblemente yo haya sido una prenda de negociación con el nuevo gobierno, ¿no? Pero al mismo tiempo yo soy dueña y trabajo en una radio que ya tiene 9 años, que se sostiene con el aporte de sus oyentes.
Perfecto, entonces déjame ir a protestar. Claro, estamos de acuerdo. Fíjate lo que pasó ayer.
Pero la verdad es que los medios que somos críticos de verdad con la élite económica de este país, no estamos experimentando un gran cimbronazo. Sí, obviamente, este es un proyecto ultra, pero para medios como el nuestro no hay grandes novedades porque medios como el nuestro se sostienen además gracias a sus audiencias y por suerte nuestras audiencias siguen estando ahí.
Bueno, ¿cómo resistir esto, no? A ver, es muy difícil, ¿no? Yo prácticamente me quedé sin trabajo, ¿no? Yo trabajo ahora para mi propio canal de YouTube, donde soy completamente independiente. En mi caso, he encontrado en mi canal de YouTube un lugar donde puedo expresarme libremente y con relativo éxito. Pero claro, esto quedó reducido a una escala muy pequeña, ¿no? Va a ser muy complicado porque además a esto se le suma la caída de la publicidad privada, que agrava, por supuesto, el cuadro económico de los medios, de las radios, de los canales. Así que, bueno, el pronóstico yo creo que es un poco adverso, ¿no?
El gran problema de Argentina son sus élites económicas. Que las élites económicas han cooptado una buena parte de la expresión. Mientras las élites económicas sigan siendo dueñas de los grandes medios de comunicación, a mí me parece que vamos a seguir teniendo un enorme problema de acceso a la información y siempre vamos a estar manifestando las mismas ideas que no son las ideas que son las mejores para las grandes mayorías, la verdad.
And finally, this past Monday, the editor-in-chief of the American magazine The Atlantic revealed he had been accidentally added to a group chat by U.S. national security leaders discussing upcoming military strikes on Yemen. The result, a juicy, unfiltered glimpse into some high-level policy discussions and a failed exercise in damage control. Instead of addressing the security breach, the Trump administration reverted to its usual playbook, attacking the press. Remember back in 2016, when the Trump campaign was all over Hillary Clinton for her emails, supposedly mishandling classified information when she was Secretary of State? Well, at least Clinton didn't copy any journalists in on any of those messages. We will leave you now with some reactions from Donald Trump's top officials, some downplaying, others straight up defending what amounts to a major security breach, one that not even right-wing media pundits could spin in the administration's favor.
So of course I didn't see this loser in the group. It looked like someone else. I don't know this guy. I know him by his horrible reputation, and he really is the bottom scum of journalists.
This Signal Gate thing is not a big deal at all. And actually, I think I can make a very good case that this was Democrat Party sabotage.
You're talking about a deceitful and highly discredited so-called journalist who's made a profession of peddling hoaxes time and time again.
This is the only thing Democrats have, is to try and call for somebody's head over what, let's use other parlance, a nothing burger.
This wouldn't surprise me if Goldberg sneaked his way in. He's the lowest of the low.